The conference room of Whitmore Senior Care smelled like coffee and glass cleaner that morning in March 2015. The white walls were lined with photos of smiling residents, old men in wheelchairs, nurses holding birthday cakes. And in the center, my parents shaking hands with the mayor of Hartford. The place looked more like a museum of their pride than a business meeting space. I stood at the end of the long mahogany table, my presentation projected on the wall. If we redirect 5% of the marketing budget to staffing and patient care, I said we can stabilize the turnover rate within 1 quarter. My voice was calm, practiced professional. I'd spent nights refining those slides. Halfway through my sentence, my father's voice cut across mine. "Clara, stop." Charles Whitmore didn't raise his voice, but it still felt like the air got thinner. "You're too rigid. You don't understand what this industry needs anymore." I blinked, forcing myself to stay composed. "Dad, the numbers." He waved his hand, dismissing both me and the data. "Numbers don't build trust. People do. This business runs on image, not spreadsheets." Across the table, my mother sat with her hands folded neatly on her lap, eyes fixed on the notepad in front of her. Eleanor Whitmore never liked confrontation. She lived by the idea that silence was refinement. Before I could respond, the glass doors opened. My sister Lauren walked in like she was stepping onto a stage. Blonde hair curled perfectly, tablet in hand, a smile rehearsed. "Sorry I'm late," she chirped, sliding into the chair beside our mother. My father's tone softened immediately. "You're just in time, sweetheart." Lauren tapped her screen and the projector changed. My charts disappeared, replaced by pastel-colored slides with soft pink fonts. "I've been working on something," she said. "A full rebranding Whitmore Cares. New logo, new tagline. Care with dignity." It's warmer, more emotional. The words hit me like a slap. Care with dignity was my phrase. I'd written it 2 years ago on a staff training manual. I looked at her, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She didn't. The board members nodded, murmuring approval. Someone even clapped quietly. My father smiled, pride flickering in his eyes. "That's exactly what I've been talking about," he said. "Lauren gets it. She understands the future." I kept my voice steady. "You mean the same future built on the systems I designed? The same reports you're calling too rigid?" He met my gaze calm but cold. "You've done good work, Clara, but sometimes leadership means knowing when to step back. What does that mean?" "It means," he said, turning to the board, "starting today, Lauren will take over our communications and image strategy. Clara will take a short leave to reassess her career direction." The room went silent, except for the faint hum of the projector. For a moment, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I closed my laptop slowly. "So after 6 years of building your reputation, I get a leave." "This isn't personal," he replied. But his tone said it was. My mother finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "It's just time for a new face, darling." Lauren smiled faintly, tilting her head as if to show sympathy. "It's not like you're being fired, Clara. It's just evolution." I could have yelled. I could have reminded them that when Medicaid froze reimbursements in 2013, I was the one who saved the company from defaulting. I could have told them every statistic, every bill I negotiated, every night I slept on the office couch. But something inside me froze instead. I stood, gathering my folders. "I don't need a break," I said quietly. "I need respect." My father didn't even look up. "This family needs faith, not arguments." The words hit harder than a shout. I nodded once and walked out. Outside, the spring air was damp, the sky gray. I carried my laptop bag to the parking lot, climbed into my car, and just sat there. Raindrops began tapping the windshield, blurring the reflection of the building I had practically lived in. For a moment, I wondered if leaving would make me disappear completely. From their business, from their story, from everything I'd built. That night, I returned to my office one last time. The halls were quiet, except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights. I packed my books, the framed photo of the first resident I ever helped, and the USB drives containing every financial model I'd ever written. As I closed the last drawer, I heard footsteps. Dr. Harold Evans stood at the door. His tweed jacket slightly wrinkled, his hands clasped behind his back. He had been my father's mentor before he ever advised me. "They're making a mistake," he said softly. "I know." He studied me for a long moment, eyes full of something between pity and pride. "If they can't see your value, let them owe you. That's a debt they'll never repay." I met his gaze. "I don't want revenge." "Good," he said. "Revenge is noisy. Legacy isn't. I smiled faintly, turning off the office lights. Then maybe it's time I start building mine. When I walked out, the rain had stopped, but the pavement still glistened under the streetlights. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of wet asphalt and freedom, realizing something sharp and bright was taking shape inside me. Not anger, not grief, just resolve. I opened my car door, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The Whitmore building shrank in the rearview mirror, its windows glowing like rows of indifferent eyes. I didn't know where I was headed yet, only that this time I would be the one writing the story, and no one would erase my name again. By July 2015, I had become another anonymous face in the New York crowd. $12,000 in savings, one suitcase, and a rented studio in Brooklyn, with a window that faced a brick wall. That was all I owned. The city hummed with the sound of ambition, but mine was quieter, slower, built from exhaustion, and the stubborn need to survive. I got my first job at a nonprofit in Lower Manhattan that provided home care support for low-income seniors. It wasn't glamorous. My title was junior accounting assistant. I filed receipts, updated ledgers, and entered expense codes into spreadsheets that looked like they hadn't been reformatted since 1999. 10 hours a day, sometimes 12. I sat in that cramped office surrounded by the hum of old computers and the smell of reheated coffee. My boss, a tired woman named Karen, once asked during lunch, "You used to work corporate, right? Why'd you leave?" I looked down at my sandwich. Family business. Didn't work out. She laughed softly. "You made the right choice. Corporate eats its own." At night, I'd walk home across the Manhattan Bridge, watching the skyline flicker like a living machine. I didn't hate my old life, but I hated the way it had turned me invisible inside my own family. Every step I took away from Connecticut felt like unlearning the language of dependence. Dr. Evans called once a week. He always started with the same question. "Learning anything useful yet?" More than I expected, I'd answer. He'd chuckle. "Good. Don't waste your time trying to win them back. Build something they'll never understand. Like what a system," he said. "The kind that runs whether they approve of you or not." In 2016, I enrolled in a nonprofit management program at NYU. I'd take the subway downtown after work, sit through lectures on tax codes, grant writing, and public accountability, then come home after midnight. My apartment became a hybrid of classroom and office. Textbooks on the bed, invoices on the counter. On weekends, I picked up freelance accounting gigs for small charities to cover tuition. It was during that time I started to see the pattern clearly. The biggest nonprofits in America looked nothing like charities. They were corporations wrapped in benevolence. They spoke of compassion, but operated with precision, structure, and influence. Their CEOs were treated like celebrities, their donors like shareholders. I realized power in this world didn't come from pity or sentiment. It came from infrastructure. If I wanted to build something unbreakable, I had to create a system, not a story. My family had spent their lives perfecting an image. I would build what existed underneath the image, the foundation they never cared to understand. The idea for my own organization came to me one night at 2 a.m. while I was reading about 501c3 compliance. The regulations fascinated me. What could be owned, what couldn't, how assets could be transferred into trusts, how governance worked. There was something beautiful in its complexity, like a hidden language of control. By early 2017, I had saved enough to register my own entity, Whitmore Foundation for Community Care. I kept the last name intentionally. It wasn't nostalgia. It was irony. I wanted the name that had erased me to stand beside me legally, forever tethered to my independence. The day the registration was approved, I walked to a print shop in Midtown and ordered a single brass plaque, Whitmore Foundation for Community Care established 2017. The clerk asked, "You want it engraved with your name too?" I shook my head. No. The name's enough. I mailed a small ivory card to Dr. Evans, an invitation, though there was no event, just symbolism. The next day he called, his voice proud and warm. "Congratulations, Clara. You didn't just change the game. You changed the board." I spent the rest of that year laying groundwork. I met with administrators at local hospitals, pitched small collaborations with community clinics, and partnered with a volunteer group that organized home visits for elderly residents in Queens. The budget was small, sometimes barely covering rent for the office I shared with another nonprofit, but every contract I signed, every program I documented, made the structure stronger. I didn't hire PR. I didn't take photos. I didn't speak to journalists. My family had built their empire on being seen. Mine would thrive in silence. Evenings in my Brooklyn apartment became my ritual. The walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbor's TV playing sitcom reruns. I'd spread papers across the floor, financial statements, tax filings, grant applications. The desk lamp cast a yellow glow over the chaos. On one particularly long night, exhaustion finally hit. I looked up from the paperwork and noticed how bare the wall above my desk was. I took a black marker and wrote directly onto the paint. "Don't hate, build higher." The words looked crude, almost childish, but they anchored me. Sometimes I'd scroll through social media and see photos of my family. Lauren at a charity gala, my parents smiling in front of banners that still said "Care with Dignity." I'd feel a flash of something between pride and bitterness. Then it would fade. They had their stage. I had my blueprint. By the end of 2017, the foundation had 3 part-time staff members, a board of advisors, and official nonprofit status recognized by the IRS. The numbers were modest, but every dollar was real, every document signed under my name. One night, as I was locking up the small office on Atlantic Avenue, I paused at the door and glanced back at the stack of files on my desk. It didn't look like much. No fame, no headlines, no applause. But it was mine. The city outside was quiet, just the low hum of traffic and the distant wail of an ambulance. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the cold air. The rain had started again, thin and soft, blurring the neon lights across the street. In that silence, I thought about my father's words. This family needs faith, not arguments. Maybe he was right, but not in the way he meant. Faith wasn't blind devotion. Faith was believing in something no one else could see yet. I pulled my coat tighter, walked toward the subway entrance, and descended into the dim underground tunnel. The metal doors hissed shut behind me. Somewhere above the city kept glittering, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was building toward it. In 2019, 4 years after I left Connecticut, my family reappeared on national television. I found out by accident. One of those too early Saturday mornings when the TV was just background noise. The screen flickered to a bright set with smiling hosts, and the words, "Morning America Families That Inspire," glowing across the bottom. And there they were, my parents sitting side by side on a white couch, hands clasped like a campaign portrait. Lauren sat between them, radiant in a white silk blouse and soft curls that caught the light just right. The chyron under her name read Lauren Whitmore, Director of Public Relations, Whitmore Senior Care. The host leaned forward. The Whitmore family has been known for their compassion and service for over 2 decades. What's the secret behind maintaining such an inspiring legacy? My father chuckled, the same charming tone he used when donors visited our facilities. It's all about family values. My daughters grew up seeing what care truly means. Then came the part that made me freeze. Lauren smiled sweetly and said, "I've always looked up to my sister Clara. She's incredibly disciplined and taught me what hard work looks like." For a moment, I just stared at the reflection of the TV in my coffee. The steam rose between my hands as her voice filled my apartment. She's the one who inspired me to take our mission further. I laughed once, quiet, sharp, bitter, the kind of laugh that doesn't sound like humor at all. On screen, a clip rolled of her walking through one of our old facilities, holding a resident's hand while cameras followed. The slogan flashed across the bottom, "Care with Dignity." My words, my handwriting from an old staff memo. The camera panned back to the host. "That's beautiful," he said. "A true example of sisterhood." I turned off the TV. The apartment fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. That afternoon, I walked through Times Square after a meeting. A new billboard loomed above the crowd. Whitmore Senior Care's rebranding campaign. My sister's face filled the entire screen, smiling beside the same tagline, "Care with Dignity." I stopped in the middle of the street as people brushed past me. For a long time, I didn't feel anger. What I felt was disbelief at how easily they had rewritten the story, how confidently they wore my work like a costume. That night, an old colleague called. "Clara saw the interview this morning," he said. "They still talk about you, you know, but it's like you're a shadow version of yourself, this background myth." "Then I guess that's all I ever was to them," I said, pacing across my tiny kitchen. "A convenient myth." After we hung up, I poured another cup of coffee and opened my laptop. The Foundation's small website stared back at me, plain and quiet, compared to the polished empire they had built. I'd avoided expanding too fast out of fear of being visible again, of drawing their attention. But maybe invisibility wasn't the same as peace. A few weeks later, during a conference on nonprofit transparency, I met a woman named Margaret Chen. She was a corporate lawyer turned nonprofit compliance specialist, sharp, in a navy suit, every word deliberate. We spoke after her panel over lukewarm hotel coffee. "You've built something real," she said after skimming through my foundation's mission statement. "But your legal structure is fragile. Anyone with more money could buy the brand out from under you." I frowned. "Even if it's a nonprofit." "Especially if it's a nonprofit," she said. "Philanthropy is just capitalism with better lighting. If you want to protect what you've built, you don't defend it with emotion, you defend it with structure." That sentence stayed with me for days. We met again the following week in her small midtown office. The blinds were drawn papers stacked in perfect piles, and every time she adjusted her glasses, I felt like I was being audited. She explained how trademarks, copyrights, and nonprofit filings could be consolidated under one name, how intellectual property, logos, slogans, operational frameworks could be owned by the organization, not individuals, how once registered at the federal level, that name would belong to the foundation permanently untouchable, unless dissolved by law. When she asked what name I wanted protected, I hesitated only a second. Whitmore Foundation for Community Care. Her pen paused midair. "You're keeping the family name?" "Yes," I said, "but this time it belongs to me." We spent 3 months filing paperwork, revising bylaws, creating governance structures. I signed every page myself, my name looping in ink over legal lines that felt like quiet revenge. The process was tedious. Meetings, fees, notarizations. But it gave me something I hadn't had since I was 28, ownership. One afternoon, as I waited in the Department of State lobby for the final registration confirmation, my phone buzzed. A notification from a news outlet, Whitmore Senior Care, expands into New Jersey. Beneath it was a photo of my parents shaking hands with a mayor, Lauren smiling in the background. I tilted my phone, studying it under the fluorescent lights. The caption underneath the photo read, "Family Legacy Continues Strong." I smiled to myself. The next morning, Margaret called. "It's official," she said. "Your trademark is approved. National registration. Nobody else can use that name or slogan commercially or publicly." I looked at the clock. 9:14 a.m., March 7th, 2019. I wrote the date on a yellow sticky note and stuck it to the wall above my desk. The first domino had fallen. That evening I took the subway to Times Square again. The same billboard glowed overhead, my family's smiling faces still selling compassion. People around me barely noticed the image, just another ad in a city full of them. But I stood there looking up the rain soft against my coat and whispered under my breath, "Enjoy the lights while you can," because from that moment forward, the name on that billboard was mine, legally, irrevocably, permanently. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I went home, turned off my phone, and wrote in my notebook. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it signs paperwork. The city outside was loud horns and voices overlapping, but inside my apartment it was quiet enough to hear my own heartbeat. I stared at the wall until the words blurred, and the only thing that remained was the certainty that the story had just changed. And for the first time, I wasn't the erased one anymore. I was the author. By the end of 2021, my mother decided to build her own legacy. She had spent her entire life standing beside my father, polishing his image, and running charity luncheons where the word impact was thrown around like confetti. But after Lauren's PR success and my father's semi-retirement, Eleanor Whitmore wanted something that was hers, a foundation that bore her name, her reputation, her version of compassion. She hired a private legal team from Stanford and began the process of registering a new nonprofit under the name Whitmore Foundation. She imagined press releases, photo ops, luncheons, in pastel-colored ballrooms. It was her way of keeping the Whitmore story alive, of reminding the city that she was still a matriarch, still relevant. The first problem arrived in an email. The attorney she'd hired wrote back 2 weeks later. "Unfortunately, that name is already registered at the federal level." My mother's immediate reaction, as later recounted by Henry Porter, was disbelief. "That's impossible," she said. "We've used that name for years. It's our family." The lawyer clarified that the registration was tied to a nonprofit entity listed under federal 501(c)(3) status. "Do you know who the owner is?" she asked sharply. "I'm afraid the registration doesn't list an individual. It's filed under a governing board. Then find out who's behind it." The lawyer hesitated. It's a sealed filing, Mrs. Whitmore. The address is a post office box in Manhattan. I'm sorry, but that's all we have. She hung up and immediately called Henry Porter, an old friend of the family, and a man who'd made his fortune by buying other people's failures. Henry. Someone's stolen our name, she said. He laughed, that slick, slow laugh of someone who's heard too many crises to take any seriously. Probably a clerical error. These nonprofits spring up overnight like mushrooms. Give it a few weeks and it'll clear itself up, but it didn't. Every database check confirmed the same thing. The name, Whitmore Foundation for Community Care, was active, legitimate, and completely out of her control. Eleanor began to spiral. She tore through old records, photo albums, invoices, anything that might prove ownership of the name. When she finally called Lauren in Los Angeles, her voice cracked through the phone. Did you register anything? Maybe for PR, or... Lauren yawned audibly. Mom, I'm in the middle of a shoot. Can this wait? Her mother's voice dropped. Someone is trying to erase us. Lauren, I didn't know any of this until weeks later when Margaret forwarded me an email. Your family's attorney has reached out regarding the trademark. They want to discuss a possible transfer or purchase. I stared at the screen, then typed back. No response necessary. Let them assume it's a coincidence. That night, I thought about my mother pacing through that perfect colonial-style kitchen, clutching her phone, trying to make sense of what had happened. I could almost hear her muttering to my father, how could this happen to us? The irony was that it hadn't happened to them at all. They had done it to themselves. The following week, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Fairfield County. It was polite, formal, and desperate. To whom it may concern, our client, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, has long-standing use of the Whitmore family name in association with charitable activities. We request clarification regarding your organization's registration to avoid confusion. Margaret called as soon as she read it. They're nervous, she said. You want to respond? No, I said, sipping my tea. They'll convince themselves it's a misunderstanding. People like my mother always do. Admitting otherwise would mean she's lost control. And losing control was the one thing Eleanor Whitmore feared most. 2 months later, I drove back to Connecticut for the first time in 6 years. My grandmother had passed away quietly at 91, and though my mother's email invitation was more obligation than affection, I went. The house looked smaller. The paint on the shutters had faded, and the rose bushes I used to trim were wilted. Inside, everything smelled like lilies and furniture polish. The air was heavy with politeness and unspoken things. The service was brief, simple, attended mostly by old family friends. I sat 3 rows behind my parents unnoticed until my mother turned slightly during the closing prayer. Her face was thinner, sharper. When the service ended, she approached me with a glassy smile. You came, she said flatly. I did. You look fine, she said, eyes flicking over my clothes as if evaluating the cost. I am fine. I paused, letting the silence stretch. You must be busy. I heard you're starting a new foundation. Her lips tightened. That's still being arranged. I see. I tilted my head slightly. Well, if you need help with the registration process, I could recommend someone who's quite good. For a second, her expression faltered. She understood. I saw it in the way her pupils shrank, the way her jaw clenched, but she refused to show weakness. I don't think we need your help, Clara. Of course not, I said gently. But names can be tricky these days. We stood there in the church vestibule surrounded by murmurs and the smell of coffee and pastries. She adjusted her pearl necklace with shaking fingers. I don't know what you're playing at, she said quietly. I'm not playing anything. I replied. I'm just living. My name still gets mentioned in places you wouldn't expect. She didn't answer. For once, Eleanor Whitmore had nothing to say. I left before Lauren arrived. The drive back to New York was silent except for the sound of rain against the windshield. The highway lights blurred into streaks of gold. Somewhere near Bridgeport, I realized I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, just clarity. Their fear wasn't born from guilt. It came from something far more primal, the realization that they no longer controlled the story. They had spent their whole lives shaping narratives, crafting appearances, curating the perfect image of grace and success. And now, for the first time, the image had slipped from their hands. I rolled down the window slightly, letting the cold night air rush in. For 6 years I had built something invisible but unbreakable, and while they scrambled to protect their reflection, I had already taken their foundation, the literal one, and made it real. The sign on the freeway read, "Welcome to New York City." The skyline shimmered in the distance, tall and indifferent. I turned up the radio, letting the static drown out the noise of the past. Some debts didn't need to be collected. They simply needed to be understood. By early 2024, my sister came back to New York like a celebrity returning to her hometown. She had been gone nearly a decade, and yet the city welcomed her, as if she'd built something instead of abandoning it. I saw her first, on a charity podcast, sitting in a soft-lit studio, legs crossed neatly, her voice smooth and bright. "My family has always believed in compassion," she said. "Even as we modernize, the heart of our mission stays the same." The interviewer smiled. "You've stepped into quite a legacy, haven't you?" Lauren tilted her head, pretending to blush. "I've always admired my sister Clara. She inspired me to follow this path." I stared at the screen in my office, my coffee cooling on the desk. The way she said my name, like I was a character in someone else's story, made me feel both visible and erased at once. A few months later, I was invited to a conference on philanthropic strategy at the New York Marriott. I didn't know she was attending until I saw her name printed in the program. Keynote speaker Lauren Whitmore, Director of Communications. Whitmore Senior Care. The day of the conference, I arrived early. The room smelled of fresh paint and overbrewed coffee. Rows of chairs filled up quickly, executives, donors, nonprofit heads. The large screen displayed her face in the opening slide, framed by the same tagline, "Care with Dignity." Lauren arrived 20 minutes late, surrounded by cameras and assistants in matching lanyards. People turned to watch her glide in like a queen late to her own coronation. She spotted me from across the room, froze for half a heartbeat, then recovered instantly. "Clara," she said as she approached, smiling for the cameras. "Wow, you're still in the field." I smiled back. "A little. I run a small foundation, Whitmore Foundation." Her smile faltered just a touch, though only someone who knew her as well as I did would notice. "Oh," she said lightly. "You're using that name too." "Of course," I said. "It's family, right?" She blinked, then turned to her assistant. "Excuse me, I need a quick prep before my panel." Across the room, a woman in a navy blazer was watching us. Nora Bennett, a senior journalist from the New York Ledger. I hadn't seen her in years, but I recognized the calculating look in her eyes. She had written about our family once, back when my father's company nearly collapsed. Her gaze flicked between me and Lauren. Then she smiled faintly, like she had just rediscovered a story that hadn't finished yet. When Lauren took the stage, her voice filled the hall, smooth, confident, rehearsed. She spoke about redefining compassion for a modern world, about legacy innovation and family. Every sentence was crafted like an advertisement. I watched from the third row, jotting notes I didn't need. What she said wasn't interesting. What she didn't say was, afterward, a few attendees approached me. "You two are sisters, right?" one asked. "You look nothing alike, but there's something in the eyes. Do you collaborate?" Sometimes I lied. "We work in the same space." Later, as I walked out, Nora intercepted me near the elevators. "You've built quite the reputation quietly," she said. "I prefer it that way." Her lips curved. "Quiet is rarely accidental. I'm just doing the work I said." She studied me for a moment, then asked, "Would you ever talk about what happened with the company?" "No," I said. "But people will figure it out eventually." 3 weeks later, the article appeared online. The headline was striking but simple. "Whitmore Sisters' 2 Paths to Compassion." I opened it at midnight, alone in my apartment. The first half praised Lauren's charisma and media presence. The second half described my foundation's data-driven approach, my years working with community hospitals, and my refusal to participate in interviews. The last line stopped me cold. Sometimes 2 paths of compassion meet where silence carries more truth than apology ever could. By morning, the article had gone viral. People loved the contrast. The glamorous sister and the grounded one, the image and the substance. Hashtag Whitmore Sisters started trending. My phone buzzed endlessly with notifications, most of which I ignored. That afternoon, Lauren called our mother in tears. "They're mocking me," she cried. "They made me look shallow. They're making Clara look like the hero." Eleanor's voice stayed calm as it always did in crises. "Stay quiet, Lauren. Silence is a strategy, too." I could almost hear the words through the walls of memory. Silence had always been my mother's armor. Now it was mine. 2 days later, a PR manager from a philanthropic magazine called asking if I wanted to do a follow-up interview. "We'd love your take on the meaning of legacy," he said. "I don't comment on legacy," I replied. "I just work." When I hung up, I pulled up Nora's article again. The comment section was a battlefield, half adoring, half spiteful. Some praised Lauren's grace under pressure. Others accused her of riding my coattails. She had always loved attention, but not like this, not when the narrative slipped out of her control. That evening, I walked through Central Park. The snow was melting into gray slush, and joggers passed by with earbuds in. I thought about how strange it was that we were finally being mentioned in the same breath again, but not in the way my parents had imagined. The public had turned our rivalry into symbolism, authenticity versus image substance versus style. I didn't hate her. I never had, but I understood something now. Lauren had been raised for applause. I had been raised for endurance. She didn't know how to exist without an audience. I had learned how to exist when no one was watching. When I reached the edge of the park, I saw a vendor packing up his stand. He glanced at my name on the receipt and said, "Whitmore, huh? Like the charity lady." "Something like that," I said, handing him a few extra dollars. That night, I sat by my window and reread the last line of the article again. Silence carries more truth than apology ever could. They were right. Silence used to be my punishment. Now it was my power. In May of 2025, the invitation arrived wrapped in ivory paper and sealed with gold foil. The New York charity auction, it read in looping script, an evening of generosity and legacy. The hosts were listed at the bottom. Charles and Eleanor Whitmore. My parents. For a long moment, I just stared at it. The irony was almost perfect. 10 years since the day they'd erased me, and here they were hosting the kind of event that worshipped everything they stood for. Image, prestige, applause. The list of sponsors was stacked with old money names and new money ambitions. But one name was missing. Mine. That night I poured myself a glass of wine and made a decision. I would attend. Not as their daughter, but as a benefactor. Whitmore Foundation for Community Care would make a donation large enough to secure a sponsorship tier usually reserved for corporate magnates. Anonymous but visible where it mattered in the legal contracts in the event registry and eventually on the screen. Ryan Gallagher, the event director, called 2 days later. His voice was efficient, neutral, the kind of tone that came from running too many galas and hurting too many egos. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. Still not realizing which Mrs. Whitmore he was speaking to. "We're finalizing sponsor documentation, but we need confirmation of your foundation's legal representative for the contracts. Just use the registered name." I said, keeping my tone steady. "Whitmore Foundation for Community Care." Nothing abbreviated. Nothing altered. He paused as though uncertain. "Understood. You'll receive the paperwork by Friday." The following morning, I met with my attorney, Oliver Brooks, at his office in Midtown. His desk was a forest of files all labeled in perfect order. He slid a thick folder toward me. "Everything's ready. Contract donation record tax documentation. The amount you're pledging automatically qualifies the foundation as a principal sponsor." "Good," I said. "That'll put us front and center." Oliver leaned back in his chair. "You realize the Whitmores are listed as the event's co-hosts. When the program lists sponsors, there's going to be confusion. The press might assume it's their organization, not yours." "Let them," I said, almost smiling. "The law doesn't make assumptions." He studied me for a moment. "You've waited a long time for this." 10 years, I said, "and all I've ever wanted is one correct introduction." A week later, I attended the dress rehearsal at the Metropole Hotel. The ballroom gleamed under chandeliers the size of satellites, the walls washed in champagne light. Staff hurried between tables, adjusting name cards, crystal glasses clinking softly. Ryan greeted me at the entrance, clipboard in hand. "Ah, Mrs. Whitmore, you'll be at the VIP section near the stage, of course." "Of course." On the stage, a massive LED screen displayed the slideshow for the sponsors. I watched as the logos appeared one by one, large corporations, fashion houses, private banks. And then it came. The name Whitmore Foundation for Community Care in clean white letters over a deep navy background. The design was flawless. "Looks beautiful, doesn't it?" Ryan said proudly. "Your team sent this over just in time." My team. He thought it had come from them. The irony nearly made me laugh. Yes, I said instead. They did an excellent job. I walked to the back of the room and watched as technicians ran through lighting cues. Lauren's name flashed briefly across a smaller banner, Event Host. Lauren Whitmore. She was everywhere lately. Magazines, interviews, panels. Her face, the currency of the family's new era. I imagined her practicing her speech the same way she'd practiced fake tears when she was 10. When rehearsal ended, I stayed behind alone in the vast ballroom. The scent of polished wood and lilies filled the air. I walked to the center of the room, looking up at the screen again. Whitmore Foundation. My name, my work, my creation. For years they had built their empire on public applause. Tomorrow, I would let the law, and the spotlight, speak for me. Later that night, I sat in my apartment overlooking the East River. The city was quiet in that deceptive way it sometimes was before something changed. I opened my laptop and reviewed the event program. Every sponsor name was neatly aligned, and mine, was written exactly as I'd instructed. A notification popped up. It was an email from Ryan's assistant confirming my final registration. Thank you for your generous contribution. The Whitmore Foundation will be acknowledged as a principal partner during the live broadcast. I read it twice, then closed the screen. The next day, Oliver called to finalize last-minute paperwork. Everything's signed and notarized. You're legally and publicly recognized as the owner of the foundation. If anyone challenges that, they'll lose. Perfect, I said. He hesitated. You're aware this could get messy, right? There will be shock, questions. I'm not planning to make a scene, I told him. I won't have to. The truth will make it for me. The day before the auction, I went to the Metropole again, this time as a guest. I watched caterers set tables with gold-rimmed china. The auctioneer testing microphones, staff positioning floral arrangements. Every detail glimmered with wealth. The kind of wealth that disguised decay. In the back corner, a row of nameplates waited to be placed on tables. One of them read, Charles and Eleanor Whitmore Event Hosts. Next to it, another Whitmore Foundation for Community Care. A young volunteer picked up both placards, frowning. Do you know which one goes closer to the stage, she asked. I smiled. The foundation always comes first, I said, and walked away. That night I laid out my dress for the event. A navy gown, understated but elegant. It wasn't revenge I felt pulsing in my chest. It was something colder, cleaner. Tomorrow I wouldn't need to say a word. When the lights rose on that ballroom and the host announced the sponsors, the truth that had been buried for a decade would surface on its own, quietly, legally, unarguably. Theirs was the performance. Mine was the proof. And I was ready for the curtain to rise. The ballroom at the Metropole glowed like liquid gold that night. Every chandelier shimmered above us, scattering light across the crystal glasses and sequined gowns of more than 400 guests. The sound of jazz floated through the air, soft, expensive, rehearsed. Waiters moved like clockwork between tables, balancing trays of champagne flutes and caviar bites. It was the kind of evening my parents lived for. I sat in the front VIP section at a table close enough to the stage to see every flicker of expression on their faces. Across from me was Henry Porter, the man who once advised my father to remove me from the company I had rebuilt. His hair was whiter now, his hands trembling slightly when he lifted his glass. He didn't recognize me at first. When our eyes met, he smiled with polite detachment, the way rich men smile at people they assume are forgettable. Mr. Porter, I said softly, leaning forward. 10 years, isn't it? His glass paused midair. The color drained from his face as realization dawned. Clara, he managed. Well, I'll be damned. I smiled faintly. Yes, you will. He let out an awkward laugh and looked away, pretending to check his phone. The band began a new song, and the lights dimmed as the evening's host took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2025 New York Charity Auction. Ryan Gallagher's voice carried easily through the speakers. I watched him from my seat, professional, composed, unaware that the most anticipated moment of the night wasn't in his script. Then came the grand entrance. My family walked into the ballroom as if it belonged to them. The applause rose like a wave. Lauren glimmered in a silver gown, her hair curled just enough to look effortless. She placed a hand on my mother's arm and smiled at photographers. My father walked beside them, his posture upright, despite the years his expression carved from pride. I took a sip of white wine. The taste was sharp metallic. The crowd parted as they made their way to the stage. Lauren's heels clicked against the marble floor, the sound confident, rhythmic, almost theatrical. Cameras flashed. The host's voice softened as he introduced her. Please welcome our event co-chair, Ms. Lauren Whitmore, representing the Whitmore family's continued commitment to compassion and care. Applause again. She waved, her smile flawless. When she began to speak, I listened to every word. Our family believes that kindness, integrity, and community are the true measures of success, she said, her voice smooth and glowing. We've spent decades serving others, and tonight we're here to continue that tradition. My father beamed. My mother's lips curved into the proud smile she reserved for public moments only. Lauren gestured gracefully toward the screen behind her. But we couldn't have done any of this without our incredible partners and sponsors. Their generosity allows our mission to live on. I set my glass down. Ryan stepped up beside her. And with that, he said, we'd like to acknowledge our principal sponsors. A special thank you to this evening's leading contributor, Whitmore Foundation for Community Care. The applause began again, automatic, polite. Then the screen changed. The logo appeared. My logo, simple white lettering on a navy field, and beneath it in clean serif font the words, founded and owned by Clara Whitmore. The sound in the room shifted. Applause faltered. Conversations stuttered mid-sentence. The first gasp came from somewhere near the back of the room, followed by a low wave of murmurs spreading like a current. Lauren's smile froze. She turned toward the screen, eyes wide. What? She whispered, just loud enough for the microphone to catch. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face flushed crimson as he gripped the edge of his chair. Henry Porter exhaled beside me, a quiet Jesus Christ. The silence stretched. Every camera, every pair of eyes turned toward me. I didn't flinch. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate, straightened my posture, and waited. Ryan hesitated, glancing down at the cue cards in confusion, but he continued, as professionalism demanded. We're honored tonight, he said carefully, to have the founder of Whitmore Foundation with us. Please welcome Mrs. Clara Whitmore. A spotlight swung across the room and landed on me. For a moment, no one moved. My pulse stayed steady, my breath slow. I could feel hundreds of eyes crawling over me, curiosity, disbelief, realization. Then I stood. The sound of my chair sliding back cut through the silence like a blade. I smoothed my dress, a dark navy gown that caught the light with each step I took. I turned toward the stage but didn't walk there. I didn't need to. I smiled. Small, calm, deliberate, and inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the host, the crowd, the chaos. No speech and no gesture, just silence. Ryan started to speak again, but the words stumbled out. Mrs. Whitmore, would you like to say a few words? I shook my head once. The spotlight lingered on me, too bright, too revealing. And yet I didn't blink. For 10 years I had lived in the shadows of their story. Tonight the light finally found its way back to the truth. The band had stopped playing. No one dared to move. Even the servers froze mid-step, silver trays hovering in mid-air. I could see Lauren's chest rise and fall quickly, her composure unraveling in real time. My mother looked like a statue. My father's jaw tightened until his lips nearly disappeared. Finally, Ryan broke the silence with a shaky laugh. Well, he said into the microphone, what an incredible surprise for this evening. A ripple of uncertain laughter spread through the room. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. The spotlight moved away, but the silence it left behind didn't fade. I glanced at the screen one more time, watching my name stay there in white letters against navy blue. Not an error. Not a coincidence. A declaration. For the rest of the program, no one really listened to Lauren's speech. She stumbled through her lines, her voice trembling in places where it used to soar. The applause that followed sounded hollow, obligatory. When the next segment began, I looked across the table at Henry Porter. He raised his glass to me in quiet acknowledgement. Well played, he muttered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The room had already said everything for me. And as the music resumed soft and uneasy, I sat back in my chair, my heart steady, my expression calm. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't invisible. The light had finally shifted, and it was all theirs to endure. Camera flashes flickered like lightning across the ballroom. The hum of whispers rippled through the crowd, restless, electric. I could feel hundreds of eyes trained on me, their curiosity sharp enough to cut. Ryan Gallagher stepped off the stage and made his way toward my table. His smile was thin, uncertain, but his handshake was firm. "Congratulations, Ms. Whitmore," he murmured quietly. "Perfect timing, huh?" I met his gaze steady, exactly on time. Behind him, Oliver Brooks, calm as ever, had taken the microphone. He wasn't supposed to speak tonight, not according to the official program, but his voice carried with a quiet authority that no one dared interrupt. For anyone seeking clarification, he began. The Whitmore Foundation for Community Care was established in the state of New York in 2017 by Mrs. Clara Whitmore. A hush fell. Every sound in the room seemed to dissolve. Clinking glasses, low conversation. Even the jazz band stopped mid-note. Oliver continued his tone, professional, deliberate, final. This organization is the lawful owner of the Whitmore Foundation trademark, its programs, and its full intellectual property rights, including the branding and media content currently displayed. The words landed like glass shattering. The entire room began to buzz again, low murmurs, at first, then overlapping voices. People turned toward one another in disbelief. I caught the flicker of phones being lifted, screens lighting up as guests began to search for confirmation. Henry Porter stared down at his phone, scrolling rapidly, his brow furrowing. He found what he was looking for, a public filing dated 2017. My name printed beneath it. He exhaled through his nose, almost smiling, and muttered something under his breath. Lauren's pale face glistened under the spotlight. Her practiced composure cracked as her smile trembled into something raw and untrained. I saw her whisper something to my father, her voice tight. "Dad, what is this?" My mother leaned forward, gripping the tablecloth. "Charles, did you know?" My father's face was flushed red, his jaw set hard. "No," he said, barely audible. "No, that's impossible." "It's not a mistake," I heard myself say quietly, though no one had asked me. On stage, Ryan glanced nervously between Oliver and the teleprompter, unsure how to proceed. The air had shifted from polite luxury to tension so thick you could hear people's hearts beating. From somewhere near the press tables, a reporter raised her hand. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying. "Can we invite Mrs. Whitmore to the stage to say a few words?" Ryan hesitated, then looked toward me as if silently begging for help. I shook my head once. "She doesn't have a prepared speech," he stammered into the mic, trying to recover. "But we are deeply honored by her presence tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. 10 seconds, maybe less. But it stretched long and heavy, pressing down on every person in the room. No one dared to move. No one lifted their glass. Even the waiters stood frozen mid-step, trays trembling slightly in their hands. My father sat back slowly, his breathing heavy, the vein in his neck pulsing. My mother whispered something to him, a plea, or maybe a warning, but he didn't respond. Lauren, pale and rigid, stared at me like I had just ruined her favorite dream. I kept still, calm, detached. I didn't need to speak. The documents had already done the talking for me. Every word Oliver read into the microphone was another thread pulled from the fabric of their carefully built illusion. I became aware of the cameras again. The flashes came faster now, snapping every reaction. The confusion, the humiliation, the dawning realization that what had once been their empire now legally belonged to someone else. To me. The host whispered something to Oliver, who nodded, then stepped down from the stage. He approached my table and bent down slightly. "It's done," he said softly. "The record's been read into the event transcript. It's official now." I looked up at him. "Thank you." Across the room, guests began murmuring in half-shocked fascination. "So she's the founder," someone whispered. "Wasn't it the family's organization?" Another voice answered. "Apparently not." At the main table, Lauren tried to steady herself. She leaned toward my father, her whisper sharp and trembling. "We need to fix this. You can't fix legal filings, Lauren," I heard him say. His tone was flat, brittle. The music tried to start again, but faltered. The pianist lost his rhythm, his fingers unsure of what song could possibly follow a public unraveling. I lifted my glass, took a slow sip, and set it down again. The wine was warm now, nearly tasteless. The weight of the moment pressed around me, but inside I felt light, detached, almost free. Then impulsively I stood. The chair scraped softly against the marble floor. All eyes followed. I looked toward the stage where my name still glowed faintly on the giant screen. I walked 2 steps forward, paused, and inclined my head slightly to the audience. It wasn't a bow, more of a quiet acknowledgement. My voice, when I finally spoke, was low but clear. "Thank you for your support." Then I sat back down. That was all. Nothing grand, nothing cruel. The silence broke in a ripple of murmurs, some clapping uncertainly, others whispering my name. A few people even raised their glasses, unsure what gesture etiquette demanded. I didn't look at my family again, but I could feel their eyes on me, burning, bewildered, betrayed. My mother's hand shook as she tried to fix her necklace. My father looked smaller somehow, like the air had gone out of him. Lauren's lips moved, but no sound came out. Ryan cleared his throat, his voice a little higher than usual as he tried to move on. "Well, what an inspiring reminder," he said, grasping for control. "That generosity often begins with the courage to care." The applause that followed was scattered half-hearted. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. The spotlight moved away, finding its next target, but the echo of that moment stayed suspended in the room. The truth had finally been spoken, not through accusation or revenge, but through clarity, through proof. For 10 years, they'd rewritten history to suit their version of the story. Tonight, with one line of legal language, I'd rewritten it back. As the band began to play again, soft and uncertain, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. The noise of the room faded into a dull hum. I didn't smile, not yet. I just sat there, still watching the truth ripple through the crowd like the slow, unstoppable tide it had always been destined to become. The morning after the auction, New York felt heavier somehow, slower, as if the city itself was holding its breath. My phone began vibrating before sunrise notifications, stacking one after another until the screen froze. By the time I opened my laptop, the headline was everywhere. "The woman they erased." Nora Bennett's article had gone live at dawn, and it was merciless in its precision. The lead photo showed me sitting beside Henry Porter, the spotlight slicing through the room, my face half in shadow. The caption read, "Clara Whitmore, founder of the Whitmore Foundation, reclaiming her family's legacy in silence." The story recounted the decade of my disappearance, the night's revelation, and how a single legal truth dismantled a dynasty built on reputation. By noon, the story was trending across every platform. Someone had clipped the 10-second video of me standing under the spotlight, nodding once before sitting down, and titled it, "Revenge Through Silence." It was viewed 3 million times in 6 hours. Ryan Gallagher was interviewed on a morning talk show, still looking shell-shocked. "We had no idea both Whitmore organizations existed," he said carefully. "But all the documentation from the state of New York lists Mrs. Clara Whitmore as the founder and sole owner of the foundation. Everything was verified and legitimate." Oliver Brooks declined most requests for comment, but one reporter caught him outside his office. "She didn't steal anything," he said simply. "She built it. That's the difference." Meanwhile, my family said nothing. My father disappeared from the public eye entirely. My mother canceled every upcoming speaking engagement. And Lauren, my brilliant camera-ready sister, deleted every photo from her Instagram, including the ones tagged #FamilyLegacy. Her page went blank except for a single story post that read, "Taking a break." It didn't matter. Screenshots of her old posts flooded Twitter side by side with mine. The heir versus the founder. The face versus the force. People argued about whether I'd planned everything. Some called it poetic justice. Others called it cruelty. I didn't read the comments for long. The noise was endless, like static that wouldn't stop buzzing. That night, an email from my mother appeared in my inbox. No subject line, just a single sentence inside. "Do you hate us that much?" I stared at it for a long time before typing back. "No, Mother, I just took back my name." I hit send and immediately closed the laptop. The message felt final, like the click of a door locking from the inside. A few hours later, another article appeared. An opinion piece titled, "The Cost of Image." The writer, a business columnist I didn't know, summed it up with one brutal line: "Nothing collapses faster than a reputation built on performance when faced with lawful ownership." I read it slowly, every word cutting cleaner than the last. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even satisfied. What I felt was release. The strange emptiness that follows survival. It was like exhaling after holding your breath too long. Freedom wasn't warm. It was cold, clear, and quiet. Outside, rain streaked the glass of my apartment window. The city lights fractured through each droplet, turning the street below into a mosaic of reflections. It looked exactly like the night I'd left Connecticut 10 years ago. The same rain, the same silence, the same feeling of starting over with nothing except conviction. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped out onto the balcony. The wind carried the faint sound of sirens, the kind that never really stop in Manhattan. Somewhere out there, my family was probably watching the same news cycle, listening to the same clips that had turned our story into theater. I wondered if they recognized themselves in it. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number voicemail left. I pressed play. It was Lauren. Her voice was quiet, hoarse. "I don't know if you'll listen to this, but I didn't know what they were doing, Clara. I really didn't. I thought we were saving the company, not stealing your work. I guess I believed what I wanted to believe." There was a pause, a shaky breath. "I'm sorry. You probably don't care, but I am. I didn't think you'd ever come back." The message ended. I didn't delete it. I didn't respond either. Some apologies weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to echo. The next morning, my foundation's website crashed twice from the surge in visitors. Donations tripled within 48 hours. Journalists emailed asking for statements, interviews, profiles. I ignored them all. Let the story tell itself. By the end of the week, even the Times updated their online feature to include a quote from Dr. Evans. "Clara didn't take revenge," he said. "She restored equilibrium." Equilibrium. I liked that word. It wasn't about victory or punishment. It was about weight redistributing to where it always should have been. That evening, I walked through Soho in the drizzle, watching umbrellas bloom like dark flowers along the sidewalk. In every coffee shop, people sat behind glowing screens reading the same story, dissecting the same drama, never realizing how ordinary it all felt from the inside. In the middle of the noise, I finally felt still. When I got home, I turned off every light except the lamp by the window. I poured a glass of red wine and opened the window just enough to let the rains chill in. New York didn't care who I was. That was the beauty of it. It just kept moving loud and alive, swallowing stories whole and spitting out new ones by morning. I took a slow sip of wine and looked down at the streetlights reflecting in the puddles. 10 years ago, I'd driven away from Connecticut under rain just like this. Angry, frightened, desperate to prove I could exist without them. Now the rain looked different. Softer. Cleansing. It was the same city, the same storm, but for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like I was running anymore. A week later, my father showed up at the Whitmore Foundation without warning. I saw him through the glass wall of my office before Oliver even had time to buzz me. He wore a gray suit, the kind that once commanded boardrooms, but it hung a little too loose now. His shoulders were slightly bent forward, his steps slow. Oliver opened the door halfway and gave me a questioning glance. I nodded. "Send him in." My father stopped just inside the doorway and looked around the office. The space was bright, understated. No family portraits, no awards, just plants and framed letters from hospitals we'd funded. He took a slow breath. "You really did it," he said, voice low. "Not you," I replied evenly. "Me." He nodded once, lips pressing together, eyes scanning the room as if trying to reconcile what he saw with the daughter he'd decided didn't belong. "Lauren's not doing well," he said finally. She's not eating. The press has been camped outside her apartment for days. She can't handle it. You've made your point, Clara. Maybe it's time to stop." I rose from my chair and walked toward the window. The skyline shimmered beyond the glass, indifferent as ever. "I already stopped," I said. "The moment the truth came out." He hesitated. "You call this truth?" "It's the only kind that matters, Dad. The kind that doesn't need applause to exist." He looked down, rubbing his temple the way he used to when a deal went bad. "She's your sister," he said softly. "She made mistakes, yes, but you could help her. You know the system better than anyone." "I already helped her," I said, turning to face him, "by showing her that the truth isn't something you can hire people to rewrite. She'll recover once she stops pretending her reflection is her worth." He said nothing for a while. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then he sighed, the kind of deep, tired sound that came from somewhere beneath pride. "Your mother." He paused, the word heavy. "She can't sleep. She's terrified this will be how people remember us. She wasn't trying to hurt you, Clara. She was trying to protect what she thought was left of our name. I studied him. For the first time in years, his confidence was gone. He looked older, gray at the temples, eyes dulled by regret. I don't need her to apologize, I said quietly. I just need her to understand that labor has value, that the invisible work, the nights, the years, the care, counts as ownership too. You don't get to call something yours just because you put your name on it. He nodded slowly. His throat worked as he swallowed, hard eyes glinting in the soft light. You were always the one with structure, he murmured. I thought we could shape you into something smaller, more manageable. We were wrong. Maybe you just didn't know what to do with someone who didn't need rescuing. A faint, sad smile crossed his face. You're the heir we never had the humility to recognize. For a moment, neither of us moved. The rain started up again, light against the glass. The city below blurred into streaks of light and motion. He stepped closer to the desk, his voice rough. You're right, you know. It was never about the company. It was about control. We thought if we controlled the story, we could control the legacy. But the story was you. The honesty in his tone hit harder than I expected. I wanted to stay detached, but part of me, some small, unguarded part, remembered the man who used to carry me on his shoulders through the nursing home hallways when I was little, introducing me to residents like I was the best thing he'd ever made. He looked at me then as if waiting for permission to breathe again. Clara, he said quietly, if I could go back. You can't, I said gently. None of us can. He nodded again. The admission seemed to drain something out of him. Then I guess I'll settle for watching what you do next. Just don't let this victory turn into another cage. You deserve more than that. I know, I said. And I won't. He exhaled, half laugh, half sigh. Your mother used to say you'd end up running the world one day. I didn't believe her. I thought you were too quiet. Quiet isn't weak, I said. No. He admitted, a small smile flickering. No, it's not. He turned toward the door, hesitated again, then added, You have her eyes. You know, your mother's. When she was still brave. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. I walked him out to the hallway. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, spilling warm light across the floor. He stepped inside, but before the doors closed, he looked at me one last time. In that moment, I didn't see the man who had humiliated me in a boardroom or erased me from a company's history. I saw an aging father who had finally realized what he'd lost. Not a legacy, not money, but his daughter. As the elevator descended, I caught his reflection in the mirrored wall, shoulders slumped, head bowed. When the doors shut, the light from the hallway flickered across my office floor. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel like I was standing opposite him anymore. We were on the same side of something, even if it had taken an empire's collapse to get there. I went back to my desk, opened the window blinds, and watched the city stretch out before me. The storm clouds were moving east, thin streaks of light breaking through. There would be more headlines, more whispers, maybe even more battles. But for now, there was only quiet. The kind I'd earned, the kind that no one could take away. A year later, the Whitmore Foundation opened its first community care center in the Bronx. It wasn't glamorous. No gold ribbons, no red carpets, no speeches rehearsed for applause. Just a simple building with sunlight pouring through wide glass windows, the scent of fresh paint and coffee drifting through the hallways, and the sound of laughter echoing from the recreation room. When I arrived that morning, the staff was already bustling, nurses arranging chairs, volunteers pinning name tags, the local high school choir practicing quietly in the corner. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, residents, neighbors, and a few curious reporters. I walked to the entrance, scissors in hand, and cut the blue ribbon. The crowd clapped softly, warm and genuine. An elderly woman sitting in the front row reached for my hand as I passed. Her skin was paper-thin and cool, her eyes bright. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, squeezing my fingers. "You brought real kindness back." Her words caught me off guard. I smiled and nodded, but for a moment I couldn't speak. The simplicity of it, real kindness, felt heavier than any headline I'd ever read. Inside, the rooms were bright and calm. Each space was designed not for profit, but for peace: community kitchens, therapy rooms, reading nooks. The staff had painted one of the walls with a quote I hadn't approved but instantly loved. "Care isn't charity, it's justice." By afternoon, the small opening had turned into something quietly beautiful. The choir sang an old gospel tune that filled the halls with warmth. A few local reporters took notes and snapped photos respectful enough to stay out of the way, Among them, I spotted a familiar face, Nora Bennett, notebook in hand, camera slung over her shoulder. She caught my eye and smiled before walking over. "I couldn't miss this," she said. "It's good to see the story come full circle." I laughed softly. "This isn't an ending, Nora. It's a correction." She grinned. "You sound exactly like your quote from last year's interview. Still allergic to triumph, still allergic to noise," I replied. She reached into her bag and pulled out a white envelope. "This came to my office last week. No return address, but I think it's meant for you." The handwriting on the front was delicate and slanted, the kind that belonged to someone who still believed in stationery. I slid the flap open carefully. Inward was a single sheet of ivory paper. "Thank you, my daughter, for proving that justice still exists." No signature beyond that. She didn't need one. I stood there for a while, feeling the weight of the paper in my hands. Nora watched quietly, sensing what it was, but not asking. "From your mother," she said softly. I nodded. "Yes. Will you write back?" "No," I said, folding the letter neatly. "There's nothing left to say. I think she already understands." We sat together on a nearby bench, watching volunteers wheel residents toward the garden. The afternoon sun slanted across the courtyard, touching everything in gold. Nora flipped her notebook closed. "Do you regret anything?" she asked after a long pause. I thought about it. About the boardroom, the courtroom, the auction, the silence. "No," I said finally. "I didn't seek revenge. I just restored order." She smiled, leaning back. "Maybe karma's not late after all. Maybe it just waits for the right recipient." I looked at her then, at the building we'd built from years of exhaustion, betrayal, and quiet persistence. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe karma doesn't come at all. Maybe we build it ourselves." The ceremony wound down as the sun began to set. People drifted away, their laughter lingering in the halls. The last of the staff turned off the lights inside, leaving only the glow from the street lamps outside the glass doors. I stayed behind, locking up the office, walking through each room one last time. The silence was soft, not empty. Like the pause after a long piece of music when everyone holds their breath before clapping. Outside, the city hummed around me. Cars passed, horns echoed faintly from a few blocks away. I made my way toward the Hudson River, where the air smelled faintly of salt and metal. The water shimmered under the fading light, restless but steady. I walked without destination, coat collar pulled up against the wind. The breeze off the river was sharp, but not cruel. It felt like it was reminding me that I was alive, that the world had moved on, and so had I. At one point, I stopped by the railing and looked out at the skyline. The lights across the river flickered like constellations. For years, I had chased peace as if it were something hidden behind revenge. But standing there, I realized peace had never been hiding. It had been waiting for me to stop carrying what wasn't mine anymore. The wind carried a whisper of laughter from somewhere behind me, the echo of the day's celebration. I smiled faintly, clutching the folded letter in my coat pocket. It wasn't forgiveness I felt. It was something quieter, older, like balance. Karma had come, not loud, not cruel, not cinematic, just precise. And as the night deepened, I finally let myself breathe in the cold air, slow and steady, knowing the war was over long before anyone noticed it had begun. It was a quiet autumn evening in Manhattan, the kind that carried a softness in the air and a kind of muted light that made the city glow without blinding you. I was attending another charity gala, not as a statement, not as a return, but simply because it felt right to be there. No tension followed me this time. No eyes tracked my every move. The flash of cameras came and went indifferent. I sat near the front with other foundation heads, people I'd come to know through the slow, steady rhythm of real work. The ballroom at the Lexington Grand was elegant but understated. Bronze chandeliers, long white tables, soft music played by a trio in the corner. There was laughter, polite conversation, a peace that didn't need to prove itself. When the host began reading the list of sponsors, the applause came evenly. Measured kind, no spectacle, no shock, just acknowledgement. As I listened, I found myself remembering another night, another ballroom, the Metropole, the weight of 1,000 unsaid words, the frozen smiles, the stopped toasts, the sound of silence breaking like glass. It felt like a lifetime ago. On the massive screen above the stage, a video began to play, an overview of the Whitmore Foundation's community projects. Footage of the Bronx Center appeared, first residents playing chess nurses, chatting with patients. a young volunteer braiding an elderly woman's hair. Then came images from Queens, where a new youth mentorship program had started. Faces, full of joy, unstaged, unfiltered. I watched as the audience smiled, some nodding. Softly others clapping, at moments that needed no prompting. No one in that room knew, or cared, that I had once been written out of my own family's story, that once I had been the name they erased from every document, every speech. What they saw now wasn't vengeance or vindication, it was just purpose. A woman across the table leaned toward me and whispered, "You must be proud." I smiled faintly. Pride isn't the word. I'm just grateful it still matters. As the video ended, I caught my reflection in the wine glass, my face softer than before, the lines around my eyes deeper, but my expression calm. The applause swelled again, and I glanced briefly toward the ceiling lights scattering gold across the room. For a moment, I wondered what my family was doing now. Whether Lauren had found something real to hold on to, work that didn't depend on applause, maybe peace that didn't need an audience. Whether my mother Eleanor still checked the papers every morning, or if she had learned to live quietly as she once told me I should. And my father, perhaps he'd finally forgiven himself, or at least made peace with the story ending differently than he planned. There was no bitterness left, just a gentle distance. I didn't need their recognition anymore. We were all living different versions of truth, and that was enough. The host began to call names. Each sponsor rose to polite applause, posed for a photo, and sat back down. When he reached mine, I barely heard him at first. And, representing one of New York's most quietly impactful organizations, he said, "Please welcome the founder and director of the Whitmore Foundation for Community Care, Mrs. Clara Whitmore." The sound of applause was steady but warm. I stood, smoothing my dress, and faced the room. The lights weren't harsh this time. They were soft golden. I bowed my head slightly, smiled, and sat down again. No speech, no explanation. In that stillness, I realized the full circle had closed, not with noise, but with quiet. The video screen changed again, showing a quote I hadn't written but believed in deeply. "Legacy is not what they remember about you. It's what continues without your name attached." As I read the words, I felt something unclench inside me. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even pride. It was relief. The rest of the evening moved easily. People laughed, glasses clinked. No tension hovered in the air. No ghosts of what had been taken. When the event ended, I lingered by the exit, shaking hands with a few donors and volunteers. A young woman approached, barely 20, her eyes bright with purpose. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said shyly. "I just started volunteering at the Bronx Center. My mom goes there every week now. She said you made her feel human again." Her words caught me off guard, and all I could manage was a quiet, "Tell her that's what she's always been." Outside, the city was cool and windswept, the sidewalks glistening under the streetlights. I walked for a while without direction, heels clicking against the pavement. The hum of Manhattan at night felt softer than it used to, less like a storm, more like a lullaby. I passed a boutique cafe, still open, its windows glowing amber. Inside, 2 older women laughed over coffee, their hands moving animatedly. Across the street, a boy helped his grandmother step off the curb, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. I stood there for a moment, watching, smiling to myself. That was what all of this had been for. Not legacy, not image, not even justice. Just the quiet preservation of decency. When I finally reached the curb to hail a cab, the wind caught my scarf and lifted it slightly, brushing my cheek like a familiar whisper. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I'd built, and what I'd reclaimed, without destroying anything in return. As the car pulled away, I looked back at the skyline, the glittering towers of a city that had both broken and remade me. And in that moment, I knew silence hadn't been my weapon. It had been my language. It spoke when I couldn't. It carried what words never could. That night, sitting in the back of the cab, the city lights sliding past the window, I realized that my silence had never been emptiness. It was the sound of peace finally settling in. And if you've ever been erased, overlooked, or underestimated, remember this: silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's just the echo of strength taking its time to be heard. Tell me, if you were in my place, would you have stayed quiet too, or spoken louder? I'd love to hear your answer in the comments below.